We're really glad to be with you here. Here's what I want to do. I want you to get your Bibles, turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, and I want you to find your place. And then I want to learn from you. I want to hear about you. And I won't put anybody on the spot here, but I want to learn about your story a little bit. So I'm just going to raise some questions. How many of you were elementary school age when you became a follower of Christ? Let me see your hands. All right. How many of you were teenagers? All right. How many of you were young adults? Whatever that means. All right. Median adults, whatever that means. All right. Older adults, whatever that means now. All right. How many of you were raised in a Christian home and your Christian conversion was really the next natural step? You had just been raised under the teaching of the gospel, and your coming to Christ was just what was expected. Folks were praying toward that end. Let me see your hands. All right. How many of you were? That's not even close to your story. God just sent somebody across your path and interrupted your life and unexpectedly caught your attention. You see your hands. All right. How many of you were baptized not in a church building? All right. In a creek or a river? Let me see hands. A swimming pool? A lake? Okay. How many were baptized by a relative? Okay. All right. How many of you were immediately discipled when you became a believer? Somebody started walking with you day one as a believer. All right. How many of you have to say, no, that really wasn't my story? People didn't walk with me right away, at least for some time. Okay. All right. How many of you, when you became a believer, you were given your first Bible ever? All right. The day I became a believer, I was 13. Last time I was here, I told my testimony, but I asked Pastor Wes about this. Would it be okay if I tell that again for those who may not have been here or those who didn't hear it the last time? I told you this morning. We were raised outside of Cincinnati. I was not a believer until God put in my seventh grade classroom a guy that I describe as a completely out of control, fanatical, obnoxious, rude, tactless 12-year-old Pentecostal preacher who every day of my seventh grade year told me about Jesus. Every day. So much so that I skipped school some days. That I just tell my mom, I'm sick because I can't take this guy. Because he would do things like he'd meet me at the classroom door. He'd say, hey, Chuck, it's a good thing you lived through the night. He would tell me. Because he would say you'd be in hell right now if you hadn't, and that's tough. Now do you know why I skipped school? I didn't want to hear from him. And here's what happened: when you hear the gospel that way, you don't sleep very well. And I literally did not. My entire seventh grade year, I would lie down at night and I would think, if he's right and I'm wrong, and I don't wake up tomorrow, I'm in a world of trouble. And I would sleep really fitfully, and I would wake up in the morning and say thank you to a God that I didn't know, that I was still alive. Well, I finally decided if I can just survive seventh grade, I'd be good, because summer break would come, I wouldn't have to hang out with him anymore, and I could escape the pressure. And I made it. I was tough all the way through seventh grade. Well, we had moved, and there's a Baptist church deacon living here and a Baptist church secretary living behind us, and they were inviting us to church, and summer break was rolling on. I knew I had to go back to school in eighth grade, which meant I had to see my buddy again. So I decided to go to church one time so I could go tell my friend. Basically, I went to church, get off my back. And I went to that church, I didn't understand a thing that was happening. So I didn't have a Bible. I didn't know any of the lingo. I didn't know what that book was that we were using to sing from. I didn't know who that guy was who got up to speak. But he got up and he started telling the exact same story that my buddy had been telling me for a year. At the end of the service, my pastor said, I didn't know he was a pastor. I didn't know what that title was. This guy who was speaking said, if you want to follow Jesus, come and talk to me. And I did. I said, I don't understand all this, but I know I need to follow Jesus. And he helped me to pray and become God's child that day. You know how I knew it was real? I slept like a baby that night because I knew I was in God's hands. Well, here's what my pastor said to me. The next Sunday, I was baptized the next Sunday. He gave me this manila envelope with apparently everything I needed for my Christian walk. My first Bible ever, a hardback red King James Version Award Bible. I suspect some of you know exactly what I'm talking about because you got the same one at some point. So I got my first Bible. A church constitution was in that envelope. Apparently I needed that to start my Christian journey, and a box of offering envelopes. So I had everything I needed to start my journey. But here's what my pastor said to me. You need to start telling people about Jesus. I was ready because the gospel was fresh and alive and real and powerful and special to me. So my pastor said, you need to start telling your family. I was ready to do that. The only problem was this. The only way I knew how to do it was the way my buddy had talked to me. And so I was equally obnoxious, equally in your face, equally challenging. And I know now that wasn't the best method. It's been a long time ago. Long time ago. But I'll tell you what, there are days that I long for that zeal again, that fire again. And that's what I want us to think about is what's it going to take for us to be evangelistic people, and what gets in the way of our doing that. And in order to think about that, I want to show you a formula. It's not original with me. The formula comes from materials about being a contagious Christian. And what I want to do is unpack that formula and make application of it to help you think about that. I want to use that as the framework for our conversations tonight. So HP, let me give you the HP. I'm going to give you each one separately. HP stands for high potency. High potency. And high potency means believers who are on fire for Jesus. Believers whose zeal for Christ is just real, alive. Now go with me to Mark chapter 1. I'm going to blitz through some chapters here and show you something. Pick up with me in verse 21. Mark's gospel is the fastest moving of the gospels. Moves very rapidly. The word immediately occurs more than 40 times in the book. And there are some words that echo through this gospel and through other gospels as well as people encounter Jesus. And I want you to see their response to him and what they do with this. And so by verse 21 of Mark chapter 1, we're already into Jesus' ministry. John the Baptist has paved the way, and Jesus has been driven into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He's called out some disciples, calling them from the sea. Then look with me at verse 21. They went into Capernaum, and right away he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and began to teach. Now, if you have your scriptures with you, look at verse 22 with me. They were what? What's the next word in your scripture? They were astonished, or they were amazed at his teaching, because he was teaching them as one who had authority and not like the scribes. They'd never heard anybody teach like this man taught. Sure, they'd heard the scribes teach, but what the scribes were teaching was what somebody else had taught them. When Jesus taught truth, he not only taught truth, he was truth. And he caught their attention like no other teacher had done. And so they're astonished at his teaching. And then verse 23, just then a man with an unclean spirit was in their synagogue. He cried out, "What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So the demons recognize who Jesus is. In fact, this is the third time in this chapter that we read that Jesus is the the Son of God, the Holy One of God. This is not just another rabbi. It's not just another teacher. It's not just another religious leader. There's something unique about him because he is the Son of God. And then verse 25, Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit threw him into convulsions, shouted with a loud voice, and came out of him. Then look at verse 27. They were all what? Tell me. They were all amazed. So they began to ask each other, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Don't miss this. Jesus teaches, and they are astonished. Jesus works miracles, and they are amazed. They'd never seen anybody quite like this. Then, once they're astonished and they're amazed, I want you to see what happens in verse 28. At once, the news about him spread throughout the entire vicinity of Galilee. And this is what I want you to catch. And I'm going to show you this throughout the next couple chapters. They're amazed at Jesus' teaching. They're astonished at his miracles. And according to verse 28, what do they almost automatically do? They talk about him. They talk about him. It's the natural response to an encounter with the Son of God, is that we will want to talk about him. Let me show you more of that. Go to the end of chapter 1. In this case, Jesus encounters a man with leprosy, and Jesus is willing to heal him. Jesus says to the man, "Be made clean." Pick up with me in verse 42. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. Then he sternly warned him and sent him away at once, telling him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." So in this case, and we could talk about that, in this case, Jesus tells him, don't go tell anybody yet. You go straight to the priest. Let him declare you clean according to your custom. But watch what the man does. Yet he went out and began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news. So in this case, Jesus tells, hold on, go talk to the priest first. And what does the guy do anyway? He speaks openly about what Jesus did, because Jesus had changed his world. Go to chapter 2. Chapter 2, the first 12 verses, there is a man who is a paralytic. You might remember his story. His friends bring him to Jesus. They can't get to Jesus because of the crowds, and so they go to the top of the roof, and they tear off a portion of the roof. They lower their friend to Jesus amidst the crowd. Jesus forgives the man's sins, and that stresses out the religious leaders. And so Jesus tells him to do something. Look at verse 10 of chapter 2. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he told the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. Let me just say to you, when the Son of God tells you to get up, take your mat, and go home, that's what you better do. And do it immediately, which is what the man did. Verse 12, immediately he got up, took the mat, went out in front of everyone. As a result, here's the wording again. They were all what? Tell me. They're amazed, or my version reads astounded. They were all astounded and gave glory to God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. They spoke. When they're astounded by Jesus, they would speak about him. Go to chapter 4. The end of chapter 4. In the latter part of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5, we learn about this Jesus, that he really is amazing. He's the master over nature. He's the master over demons. He's the master over sickness. He's the master over death. Verse 35, on that day when evening had come, he told them, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. So they left the crowd and took him along since he was in the boat, and other boats were with him. What Mark does, before I read the next part of this verse, what Mark does in all of these stories is he tends to pile up phrases to show us chaos of nature, and chaos of the heart, and chaos in a home. And he wants us to see that Jesus walks into this chaos and changes lives. And so he doesn't just say there was a great storm. Rather, he says in verse 37, a great windstorm arose, and The waves were breaking over the boat, so the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. Why is he sleeping, by the way? What's the most logical reason? Why is he sleeping? He's tired, and his humanity is weary. He's also sleeping for this reason. He's not worried. He's the master over nature. When you're the master over nature, nature seemingly out of control doesn't bother you. It's the disciples who get concerned. So they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They should have known better by now. They've been with him long enough to recognize a little bit about who he is, but they've got a long way to go. And the next verse says, "And they were terrified and asked one another, 'Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. Who is this with us?'" They should have known more, but they still had so much to learn. When's the last time that you were so amazed by Jesus that all you could say is, "Who then is this? How much more I have to learn about who he is." Just growing in wonder about him. Then we go to chapter 5, and there is a man also out of control. Look at verse 3. This man with an unclean spirit, he's living among the tombs, and listen to his chaos. He lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. Look at his world. In anguish, you can hear his anguish cries echoing off those hillsides. He's tried to probably, and gashing himself with stones, probably trying to take his own life. He's broken the shackles and the chains, and nobody can bring control and peace to his life until the Son of God shows up. And Jesus casts the demons out into the swine. The swine leap into the sea, and that bothers all the people in the area, and they beg Jesus to leave. But get with me to verse 18. Here's what we read in verse 18, same chapter. As he was getting in the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. You know what? That makes a lot of sense to me. If I'd been living among the tombs and no one wanted to come near me, and I was the crazy man of whom mamas would say, "Don't you go near the graveyard because of that man who lives there," and now I'm in my right mind, made whole, I promise you I'd want to hang out with Jesus. And here's what Jesus tells him. Verse 19, Jesus did not let him, but told him, "Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you, how he has had mercy on you." So he went out and began to proclaim to the capitalists how much Jesus had done for him. And they were all what? Tell me again. They were all amazed. I love this part of the story because I think about this guy making his way back to the Decapolis, back to the place where he grew up, back to those cities. And I can see people seeing him come from a distance, and I can just hear people saying, "Hey, who is that?" And he gets closer, and people look. Is that who I think that is? I think that's the man that was living in the graveyard. And I can even see some people as he gets closer, because remember, he was supernaturally strong. He's breaking the shackles and the chains, screaming in the night. I can see people, I think that's who he is, even as they're backing away from him. But then he makes his way. Hey, something has happened to him. He's different. That isn't a something that's happened to him. It's a somebody that has happened to him. And it's the Son of God. I suspect many of us in this room can tell the stories of that kind of transforming power of the gospel, where God just took people and changed their lives. I remember in my first church, I was pastoring in southwestern Ohio. I was a 20-year-old pastor. My hair was shoulder length. I was single. Hadn't done my undergrad degree yet. I had no idea what I was doing. it was a very small church that wanted somebody to preach at very little expense, and I came cheap, and so they hired me. I wasn't there long when one of my deacons said to me, I want you to go with me to visit this man in our community. And he warned me. He said, he is the meanest man you will ever meet. And in fact, he said, we take all of our pastors to see him. We take every evangelist who comes to lead a revival. Everybody goes to see this guy because he'll listen to nobody. I said, all right, I'll go. I went and I met him, and they were right. He probably was the meanest man that I'd ever met in my life. His wife was a member of our church. She came one Sunday. She'd gone out after the service. She shook my hand and said, I hit him with a skillet this morning. And I said, that probably wasn't the right thing to do. But the more I got to know him, I suspect he earned the skillet. Well, he showed up in church one day. Real small church, so I could see everybody in the auditorium. He sat as far back in the back as you could sit. He crossed his arms, and he scowled at me the whole time. He scowled at everybody. Didn't speak to anybody. At the end of the service, I stood back in the back shaking hands. He brushed my hand away and walked right past me. Never said a word to me. He showed up the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday. And then finally one Sunday, every Sunday it was the same deal. Then finally one Sunday, we had a response time, and we invited folks just to respond as the Lord led them. And I was standing in the front, and we started to sing, and he stepped out of that back pew, and he came toward me. And again, I reached out my hand, and he again brushed it away. But this time he fell on the altar and wept his heart out as God melted him. And he became one of my best friends in that church. I still have pictures of him and our music leader, the three of us, arm in arm, as Brother Glenn became an incredible man of God. Later became a deacon in one of our churches. Only God does that. Only God does that. And when we can tell more and more of those stories, we've got to speak about this Jesus who changes lives. That's what we see with this man. They're all amazed. Look at what Jesus did. And then Jesus heals a woman who had had a blood disease for 12 years. Let me show you something. Look at verse 25. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. So look at that. For 12 years she has sought healing. She's no better at all. She spent all of her money. She's gone to all the doctors. On the contrary, she became worse. But I want you to see verse 27. Her world is about to change, and here's why. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. Having heard about Jesus. Look at what the Bible doesn't tell us here. Who told her something about Jesus? We don't know. Why not? Because the story is never about the witness in the first place. It's never about us. Our responsibility is to go talk about Jesus, whether or not our name is ever included in the story. If we have to have our name in the story, we're not likely to do much witnessing because we make the story about us. Somewhere behind this woman's life is an unknown person who talked about Jesus, and we still read about this woman's life because somebody told her something about Jesus. And then surrounding that event is the story of Jairus, whose daughter is dying. Jesus agrees to go touch her. He doesn't get there in time. The daughter dies. Jesus puts everybody out of the house, and he raises the little girl from the dead. Look with me at verse 42 of chapter 5. Immediately, this is when Jesus said to the little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were what? Tell me again. My version reads, utterly astounded. And then in verse 43, we have a similar situation that occasionally we have in Mark's gospel where the timing isn't right to go speak. In that time, probably because they were in Jewish territory and the Jews misunderstood what kind of Messiah was was coming. They weren't ready. And so in this case, he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Guess what they did? If you read all the gospel writers, they went and told everybody anyway. I ask you again, how do you not when your daughter who is dead is now alive? Now, our command has been, go make disciples of all the nations. We don't have any such command, delay. Our command is go and speak. Now, watch what happens in chapter 6. He left there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him, here's the wording again, they were astonished. So they hear him, they're astonished, and look at their first response. Where did this man get these things, they said? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? And how are these miracles performed by his hands? So they start out up here, filled with astonishment over Jesus, trying to figure out, where does he get this teaching authority? Where does he get this miraculous power? But it doesn't take them long in verse 3 to reduce him to, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us? So they were offended by him. At first they're astonished. Where did he get all this? But then they think it through. But wait a minute, he's just one of us. They reduce him to the norm. And that's when Jesus says in verse 4, Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives and in his household. He was not able to do a miracle there except he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. Look at verse 6. And he was amazed. To this point in this gospel, it's been the people who've been amazed. Now it's Jesus, and he was amazed at their unbelief. He was going around the villages teaching. He was amazed at their unbelief. You see, at one point they were astonished, but then he's just one of them. And he's amazed. Here's what I wonder about today. I wonder if Jesus is ever amazed that you and I, who were once astonished by him, have reduced this to the norm. That even Jesus has become routine to us. High potency means Jesus is very astonishing, very amazing to us. And how do we know? How do we know if Jesus has become routine to us? What do we know from this reading of the first 6 chapters of the Gospel of Mark? If Jesus is amazing to us, what will we do? We tell others about him. So one of the ways we determine how astonished we are by Jesus is we ask this question: do I automatically tell people about Jesus? Does the story of Jesus just fall off my lips, almost as if I can't help it because he's so astonishing to me? That's high potency. And I think what happens for many of us is this: the fire that we have as a new believer, that zeal that's unbelievable, so that we would tell a wall about Jesus. For many of us, that zeal settles down. That fire gets quenched. It gets quenched by the routine. It gets quenched by ongoing sin struggles in our lives. It gets quenched by doubt sometimes. It gets quenched because we don't develop the spiritual disciplines in our life. And sometimes, honestly, it gets quenched because we hang around other believers whose fire also went out. And so I want us to think about that. Where does this start? It starts with believers who are on fire for Jesus. That's HP. Here's CP. CP is close proximity. Close proximity. I want you to do an exercise with me. In your notes, on your phone, in your head. And I think maybe your church will do better at this than other churches, where you should already have a head start from what I know about you. I want you to make 2 lists for me. Here's list number 1. I want you to list the names of 10 believers with whom you are close enough that you can share a prayer concern today. 10 believers with whom you're close enough that you can share a prayer concern. Just jot them down, think them through in your head, type them into your phone. All right, here's the second list I want you to make. List for me the names of 10 non-believers with whom you are close enough that you could share the gospel with them today. 10 non-believers with whom you are close enough that you can share the gospel with them today. I've already seen on your tables that you're challenged to have your 3 already, and so you should be ahead of the game as a member of this body. All right, tell me, for many of us, which list is harder? First one, second one? The second one. Here's what close proximity means. Close proximity means I am intentionally in relationship with non-believers. Intentionally in relationship with non-believers. Because God loves them, and I love them, and I want them to know Jesus. Doesn't mean, look, I just have non-believing neighbors, I work with non-believers, I go to school with non-believers. That's not close proximity. Close proximity means I am intentionally reaching into their lives, and I want to befriend them, and I want them to know that God loves them and that I love them, and I want them to know Christ. They literally become our friends. You see, we're never going to reach our community if we don't know many lost people in the first place. And what happens is, and frankly, I would argue that this is one of Satan's very subtle strategies to turn the church inward, is that we get cocooned among believers. And I get that. I work for Southeastern Seminary. I work for the International Mission Board. I work with an organization called Church Answers. I write for several different organizations. I'm an interim pastor in a church in Virginia. My whole world is wrapped up in believers. If I don't intentionally get outside the bubble to develop relationships with non-believers, I don't have any business being a professor of evangelism and missions. But it means I have to work at it. And I think that's the case for most of us. Close proximity means, God, I want to be a genuine friend with somebody who isn't a believer. And I'll tell you, it's not easy. It's not easy when people talk differently and act differently and think differently. And they just live differently than you and I do. But we're not going to reach them if we don't love them and if we don't know them. And we need God's help to do that, yes? I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Close proximity again means I am intentionally in relationship with non-believers because God loves them and I love them and we want them to know Jesus. Then CC is clear communication. CC is clear communication. Clear communication means I know how to share the gospel. I know how to share the gospel. I know how to transition a conversation to the gospel. I know how to tell people what Jesus means to me, what Jesus has done in my life. And in the context of doing that, I can talk about the fact that we are all sinners separated from a holy God. We, by our nature and by our actions, we choose to rebel against the Creator, and consequently, we are separated, and the judgment on that is death. The penalty for that is death. But God so loved us that He sent His Son to die in our place and to bear the wrath of the Father for us, so that if we trust Jesus and turn from our wrong, we can become God's children again. We can be forgiven and cleansed, and God drops our sin to the bottom of the ocean, and He throws it behind His back, and He separates us from our sin as far as the east is from the west, and He remembers it no more, and He makes us white as snow, and He blots out our sin, and God makes us His children again. We have a story to tell, don't we? We have a story to tell. Clear communication means I know how to tell that story. So let me give you let's talk about some simple ways to do this. There's a reason I asked you questions early on about your conversion experience, about your stories, so I can learn about you, so I can learn some things about you just by asking some simple questions. I want you to look around the people sitting with you at a table. I'm assuming you made the choices you made to sit with people, probably with people you know or people you want to get to know. We all just gravitate. I don't care how big the crowd is. We gravitate to people we know. It just happens. I want to ask you a question. How many of you are sitting with somebody at your table whose Christian conversion story you do not know? Somebody at your table, you don't know how God saved that person. Let me see your hands. All right. My guess is, now I was at a table with a bunch of family members, I think, over there, but that's not even a guarantee. See, here's what I want you to think about. I'm going to put you to work here for just a minute. We're called to go tell our stories to non-believers who sometimes don't want to listen, who sometimes can push back. We send our missionaries to places where telling their story can be risky. And we're expected under the call of the gospel to talk about Jesus in our life to people who sometimes have never heard of him, who sometimes follow other world faiths, who sometimes aren't going to pay any attention to us, who sometimes may so not want to hear our message that it costs us a friendship. There's always a risk in that. So I understand that can be tough to cross that line to speak about what Jesus has done in our life. But here's my larger concern. We're calling each other to go tell our stories to non-believers when we don't even tell our stories to other believers. Some of you, I'm guessing, you have friends in this church that you hang out with all the time. You have lunch with them regularly. Some of you, you're vacationing with people. You're in the same go group with people. You sit on the same pew with people because that's just what we do. And you do not know how God saved them. Yes or no? Because we don't tell our own stories to each other. And here's what I want you to think about. What would happen if, and maybe some of your go groups are already doing this. What would happen if every time you gathered, somebody told a story? Let me tell you in 3 minutes how God saved me. What would happen if we heard a story of grace every time we gathered? If I were pastoring full time again, I would have some folks record their testimonies. I wouldn't give everybody a microphone. Let me be clear on that. Most of us have learned the one time too many times. One time we gave the microphone to the wrong person. We'd never do it again. But I would find some folks who in 2 or 3 minutes could tell us this is what Jesus did. And I would show that story every single Sunday morning. Because I want us to recognize something. We sit with trophies of God's grace because that's who we all are. We're all destined for eternal judgment, and God rescued us, yes? And he transferred us from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of his beloved Son. And we all have a story to tell. And if we hear the stories of God's grace every single Sunday, we hear how those stories are told, we're inspired by the stories themselves, we will tell others about Jesus. So I'm going to put you to work here for a minute. And you can decide who's going to be on the spot. I want somebody at your table. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to tell the rest of your table how Jesus saved you. I don't know who's going to tell it. If nobody does, I don't know what we're going to do. I trust somebody at each table, even if you're family members, somebody will tell, this is how Jesus saved me. You with me? Talk to each other, convince somebody to do it. You have 3 minutes, go. Okay, let's begin to wrap up your story. All right. First of all, those of you who jumped in there and told your story, thank you for helping me out there. How many of you heard a story of God's supernatural intersecting grace where God just changed a life? I trust that all of you heard something, yes? You heard how God works and He orchestrates the events of our life that we might hear the gospel, that there is a 12-year-old classmate sitting in my 7th grade classroom next to me who loved me enough as a 12-year-old to just keep telling me about Jesus. And God's pursuing grace that for some of us, He just didn't give up on us. We could not outrun Him. And if we hear those stories again and again and again, and we get to know our fellow church members at that level, at the intimate level of, let's hear God's gracious story in your life. And not only that, but there are so many other stories we can tell about times when we've been a believer and we find ourselves on the mountain and suddenly find ourselves unexpectedly in the valley. And God graciously carries us through that. And sometimes we just don't tell those stories enough. If we would just learn to talk to each other more about this is what God has done in my life and this is what God is doing in my life, I think we would tell the story more to non-believers because it's just more natural for us. If we can learn to do it in the safe place of the church, we can learn to do it outside the church. Does that make sense? That's clear communication. It's learning how to tell our story, and that leads into the telling of the gospel. Well, let me give you a simple way that works for me as I seek to share the gospel with people. My own training in evangelism was we were taught to look for bridges, to try to build a bridge from a conversation, to learn about somebody's family, their occupation, their job, their religious background, and move to the message and look for ways to transition from some conversation into the gospel. And I get that, and I'm not opposed to that at all. But sometimes, for me at least, it felt like I was always trying to listen with one ear while I'm also trying to figure out what's the side door to get in the gospel. And it always felt just a little awkward for me. So let me just tell you what I do in this culture anyway. When I'm traveling overseas, sometimes this is much more difficult to do. In some places, it's illegal to do. And so you have to think out another way to get there. But in this culture, I've just come to the place where I'll just say to somebody, particularly if they know me much at all, I'll just say, look, you know me. You know that I'm a follower of Jesus. And one of the things that followers of Jesus do, we just like to tell about what He means to us. So may I take 5 minutes and just tell you what Jesus means to me? And it's really that simple. And I can tell you, it's not often that somebody tells me blatantly no. And if I ask permission, I just take 5 minutes. You know who I am. I'm a follower of Jesus. And if they don't know me, I can tell them that. I'm a follower of Jesus, and this is what followers of Jesus do. May I have 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, to tell you what Jesus means to me? And if you're in the practice of doing that already with other believers, it's easier to get there. If they tell me no, here's what I know. I've gone as far as I can go right now. I've tried to open that door. Now I can pray. What am I going to pray? What did we talk about this morning from Colossians? I'm going to pray more now. God, give me an open door for this. Apparently that door is not open right now. But God, you give me the open door, and don't let me miss it when that door is open. So now I've at least pushed the door a little bit. And I can simply say, hey, thank you for being honest with me. Maybe we can talk another time. And I'll watch for that other time to do so. But I've aimed to share the story with that person. I tried. I just didn't get there all the way. But if other persons tell me, and more persons have told me yes than no, if other persons say, yeah, you know what, I'll give you 5 minutes. The door is wide open for me to tell what Jesus means to me. I'm not trying to figure out how to get there. They've given me permission to get there. And so I can just tell them, hey, let me tell you what Jesus means to me. And the story of that, as I talk about my buddy telling me about Jesus, that's where I can weave into, here's what my buddy told me about my needing a Savior and how Jesus died for me and what I need to do to follow Jesus. And I chose to do that as a 13-year-old, and God gave me sweet peace even that far back. And in 5 minutes, I can get that story in and ask, hey, would you like to talk more about that? Would you be interested in following Jesus? What I do have to do is honor my request. If I ask for 5 minutes and take 15, that's a problem. If I ask for 5 and they give me more, that's fine. But I want to be a person of integrity. If I ask for 5 minutes, I want to make sure I take 5 minutes, which means I have to know how to tell my story in 5 minutes. I want you to think about tonight, who are those persons in your life that you could ask that question? You just haven't done it yet. You could go to them and say, you know I follow Jesus. You know who I am. And this is what followers of Jesus do. I've never really taken 5 minutes to do that with you. Would you give me permission to do that? You heard from Pastor Mike this morning. This is exactly the week to do that. Because folks are thinking about, well, they go to church on Easter, and at least thinking about what Easter means at some level. And it's just an easy way to get there, at least to try to get there. If they say no, you press on, you keep asking other people. Somebody's going to say yes. And I can tell you this, the more opportunities you have to tell your story, the more you're going to want to tell your story more. And that's what I want for you, is to simply figure out a way that I can step into somebody else's life, tell them what Jesus means to me, weave the gospel into that simple presentation, and then open the door to talk more as God allows. You with me there? That's clear communication. It's not hard to tell what Jesus has done in your life, what he means to you. It's your story. Nobody can tell it like you can tell it. Nobody can refute it because it's your story. And as you really do move in and out of the gospel in the midst of telling that, you can walk away knowing, I've done what God calls me to do. And there is great joy in being obedient and telling the story of Jesus. That's clear communication. So when you put all this together, believers who are on fire for God, who actually know lost people, who know how to share the gospel, the result is maximum impact. That's MI. The result is maximum impact. Maximum impact in evangelism. So let's talk about this for just a little bit. You see the formula here, HP plus CP plus CC. As you think about evangelical churches in North America, where do you think we're strongest? I'm not asking you to answer the question. I just want you to think about it. Are we strongest at HP? We're most on fire for God. CP, we're actually in relationship with non-believers. Or CC, we know how to share the gospel. And let me give you a caveat. I don't think we're strong at any one of the three. I think we're weak in every single one of those areas. So what I'm really asking you is, what's our strongest weakness? And I'll tell you what I think our strongest weakness is. I think we're probably strongest at clear communication because we at least have the resources. We have the resources to tell the story. We have the trainings to tell the story. We have what we just did. In a couple of minutes, I talked to you about sharing your story with other believers and then intersecting lives with non-believers, asking permission to tell the story that is your story. We've done that. And some of you, I suspect, somewhere along the way, you've had some training in evangelism. Would I be accurate about that? Somewhere along the way, you've had some training. A lot of folks haven't, but some of you have. So I think that probably is our strongest point. So where are we weakest, HP or CP? I think our weakest part is HP. Now let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to challenge you to think about this with me for a minute. HP means you are on fire for God. It means the zeal of Christ burns in you, and you are being conformed to the image of Christ. You're becoming more and more like Christ as God does his work in your life. Here's my question. Is it possible to be HP? You're just growing and becoming more and more like Christ. And not be CP, in close proximity, intentionally in relationship with non-believers. I just want you to think about it for a minute. And you may differ with me, that's fine. I'm going home tomorrow. So you may differ with me, it's not an issue at all. If that happens, I think it's only very temporary. I do not believe you can fall in love with God and grow in your relationship with God and catch the fire of God and become more and more Christ-like, more and more like God, who pursued Adam and Eve in their sin, who sought them in their rebellion, who raised up a people out of whom he would send a Redeemer, who came himself for us, who died for us while we were yet sinners, who woos us through his Spirit, and who does not delight in the death of the wicked. I'm convinced that the more we burn for Jesus, the more we will intentionally figure out how to get in relationship with non-believers, because that's the heart of God. Now, sometimes my students at the seminary, we go round and round about this. No, that's probably too strong. But they tell me, Dr. Wallace, I'm more on fire for God than I've ever been, because I'm reading all these books about God. And I'm reading my Bible because I'm in New Testament class and Old Testament class. And I'm in chapel twice a week, or they're supposed to be in chapel twice a week. And I'm learning Greek and Hebrew. And so I'm on fire for God. And my question to them is, so when's the last time you got off our campus and told somebody about Jesus? And some of them will say, no, I'm too busy for that. I've got too much homework to do. And we do keep them busy, that to be fair. We give them a lot of homework. But here's what I say to them. I want you to be careful. Because if you say you're more on fire for God than you've ever been, but you're not talking to people about Jesus, you might be on fire for learning, not for God. And where I think we have to look at this again is we have to go back here to say, God, help me. Reignite my fire for Jesus like it was when I first became a believer. Because here's what happens in churches. When we want people to do evangelism, we establish an evangelism training, and I believe in that. That's what we're doing here tonight. So I think there's clearly a place for training. But sometimes what happens is we run to a program, that's CC, to get people to do evangelism, and we're trying to program evangelism into them when they've lost their fire for God and they don't know lost people in the first place. And the program doesn't go very far. Here's where this has to start. God, take me back to a childlike faith where I just wanted to talk about Jesus. Take me back to those days when I was obnoxious a little bit. And help me to see with your eyes the crowds that are sheep without a shepherd. Help me to wonder about that convenience store clerk. I wonder if she knows Jesus. Help me to wonder about my doctor. I wonder if he knows Jesus. The person who cuts my hair. I wonder if he knows Jesus. That coworker that I don't know very well, I wonder if he knows Jesus. And then couple that with what we talked about this morning. You ask God to reignite your fire and to give you eyes to begin to see and to begin to love lost people again. And meanwhile, you've got other members of this body praying for you to speak the gospel boldly and clearly and they're not missed opportunities. And you've got a story to tell. In 5 minutes, you can tell your story to somebody, and we can begin to see the evangelism fire begin to grow in this congregation or continue to grow in this congregation. And all of us can do that. Yes? We all can. That's what I'm convinced we have to do if we're going to become evangelistic churches in North America again. And it seems to me, as the more and more I learned about your church, you're way ahead of the game. Way ahead of the game. Stronger than most churches that I get to be a part of. Pam told somebody this morning, I was here a couple years ago, I told Pam then, the next time I go to that church, you got to go with me. And yes, it is her birthday, so I needed her here with me. But I did tell her, did I not? Did I not? I said, you just got to go. Because I love what God's doing here. But here's what we have to think about. Sometimes when God's doing good things through the congregation as a whole, sometimes it's easy to just sit back in the woodwork a little bit and not be all that we need to be individually. And what I want for each of you is the fire of God that so burns in you that you see people differently. You love a lost person. You develop a friendship with a lost person, perhaps one of your three, and your heart just breaks for them like we talked about this morning. And others are praying for you to speak the gospel boldly and clearly. And you're asking God for that opportunity. And you can say, hey, you know me. I'm a follower of Jesus. May I take 5 minutes? And let's just see what God does. Okay? All right. Where's Pastor Wesley? Take it from here, my brother. Thank you.